Over. The boy at the door of the arena looked maybe 19, broad-shouldered and officious in the way that only young men handed a clipboard and a lanyard can be. Sir, this is reserved for verified attendees and media personnel. Do you have your registration confirmation? The old man standing in front of him didn't answer immediately, as he was looking past the boy, through the glass doors, at the floor of the Scotiabank Arena where a temporary stage had been assembled over the hockey ice. Rows of chairs were filling with men and women in dress uniforms, the brass of medals catching the arena lights. A banner hung from the rafters, honoring the fallen. Royal Canadian Mounted Police K9 Division Memorial Service, 2024. Sir? The man turned his attention back to the boy. He was somewhere north of 70, with a face that the years had not so much aged as compressed. The skin tight against the bones, the eyes set deep, the color of lake water in November. He wore a flannel shirt, the kind sold in 3 packs at Canadian Tire, tucked into dark trousers that had been pressed but showed a crease on the wrong side. A crease a man puts in himself who doesn't own an iron and uses the edge of a table. His jacket was a barn coat, olive green, the collar worn smooth. He carried nothing. No lanyard, no phone, no printed confirmation. I don't have anything like that, he said. His voice had no apology in it, as the voice of a man stating a geographical fact. Then I'm going to have to ask you to wait in the public viewing area. We have screens set up in the lobby. The boy gestured behind him, toward a cluster of people standing before mounted televisions showing a test pattern. The old man looked at the lobby screens. Then he looked back through the doors at the stage. He nodded once, a single deliberate movement, and took 1 step sideways, placing himself to the left of the doors, out of the flow of foot traffic, but not in the lobby. He had complied with the geometry of the request and not one atom of its spirit. The boy frowned, decided this was close enough to resolved, and went back to checking lanyards. Oaksa. Staff Corporal Natalie Oakes had been with the RCMP K9 Division for 11 years, long enough to have earned the quiet authority that comes not from rank, but from competence. Acre. She stood near the handler's staging area with her partner, a 7-year-old German shepherd named Rideau, watching the floor fill up. Esteter. Rideau sat at her left knee with the patient attention of a dog who understood ceremony even if he didn't speak the language of it. Alliers moved independently, filing information, dismissing most of it. Oakes had spent the morning managing logistics. 14 K9 teams from 5 provinces had come in for the service. 6 K9 officers were being posthumously honored. 4 killed in the line of duty over the past decade. 2 who had died of illness in recent years. Service. The kind of service that required precision and composure in equal measure. The kind of service where things going wrong felt like a second loss. Extring. She was reviewing the procession order when Rideau broke his sit. Not dramatically, not with barking or lunging. Just a subtle forward shift of his weight, nose dropping and then lifting, just rotating like small satellite dishes toward the entrance. Oakes put a hand on his withers without looking up from her notes. Easy. Rideau returned to his sit, but the set of his body had changed, a low-current alertness. Different from his working mode, different from his social mode, between the two. Oakes had never seen him make quite that shape before. She looked up. Through the glass doors she could see the old man in the barn coat, standing to the side, watching. The service began at 2 o'clock with the national anthem performed by a student choir from Carleton University, which was slightly flat in the second verse, but full of something more important than perfect pitch. Offrey. A senior RCMP commissioner opened with remarks that were dignified and appropriately brief. Aptizu Frajun. A federal minister who had never ridden a horse or walked a dog in a professional capacity spoke for 4 minutes longer than the program indicated she would. Estimation. The families of the fallen handlers, sat in the front 2 rows, their grief the kind that has had time to calcify into something that looks, from the outside, like composure. Other handlers. Oaks stood with the other handlers along the eastern wall of the floor, their dogs in perfect heel position. It was the holding pattern before the procession. 14 teams who would walk to the memorial display at the center of the stage, each carrying a wreath, each pausing for a moment of silence before the footprints of the fallen K9s. She watched the old man through the glass whenever the angle allowed. He hadn't moved, stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, his weight equally distributed, his gaze on the stage with an expression she couldn't quite read from this distance. Not sentimental, not disconnected, and more considered than either. A retired deputy commissioner named Harlan Whitford was giving the keynote address, has served 32 years, and spoke with the fluency of a man who had given many such speeches. He spoke of courage and sacrifice, of the unique bond between officer and animal, of how a dog asks nothing of the work except to do it faithfully. He used the phrase, "our four-legged partners," 3 times in 4 minutes. He meant well. Every word was true, and none of them were sufficient. Oaks had heard versions of this speech at every memorial she'd attended. She honored the intention behind it. There was always a gap between the language of ceremony and the reality of what it was actually like. The hours, the training, the specific texture of grief. When a working partner didn't come home, effort you saw. The speeches reached for that reality and couldn't quite touch it. They were fingers pointing at the moon. Through the glass, the old man's jaw tightened slightly at something Whitford said. Just a small movement, a compression of muscle. His eyes stayed on the stage, us. And then, so briefly Oaks almost didn't catch it, they closed, one breath. And when they opened, they were the same, but somehow heavier. He was not watching a ceremony. He was attending a funeral he had been to before. The procession was scheduled to begin after Whitford's remarks. Oaks moved her team into position with the others. 14 handlers, 14 dogs, arranged in 2 columns. Anne was clean. Walk in formation to the stage, halt at the designated markers, present the wreaths in sequence, hold for 60 seconds of silence, and withdraw. They had run it twice in rehearsal that morning. It was clean. It was composed. It was exactly right. They were 8 steps into the arena floor when it started with a dog named Boreal, a Sepric. Boreal was a 10-year-old Belgian Malinois, one of the oldest working dogs on the floor, and precisely because of his age, he was the last dog anyone would have expected to break. He had more ceremony hours than most of the handlers. His discipline was not a performance. It was structural, built into him the way load-bearing walls are built into a building. His handler, Sergeant Dolan, had never once in 4 years seen Boreal do anything without a command. Boreal stopped walking. Off he stopped, as though someone had switched off a circuit. His nose went down, swept left, swept right, then lifted in a long, slow arc toward the main doors. He let out a sound. Not a bark, not a whine exactly, something between them. A low searching note that seemed to come from somewhere older than his training. Dolan gave a firm leash correction. Boreal. Heel. Boreal didn't heel. He turned his head toward the glass doors and his tail began to move. Not the loose, happy wag of a social greeting, but a focused, tight oscillation that Dolan had only ever seen when the dog was identifying a scent he had been specifically trained to find. He was working, but he hadn't been given a task. Then Rideau, at Oaks's left side, pulled, not aggressively, with intent. She felt the leash go from loose to taut in one clean movement, and Rideau's entire body aligned like a compass needle, pointing at the old man through the glass. Within 30 seconds, it was happening down the line. Not all at once, but rippling. One dog, and then the next. Heads rising, noses lifting, bodies turning with a uniformity that had nothing to do with training commands. of a German shepherd named Clearwater, pressed forward against her leash, a Labrador named Corporal, an old joke that had stuck, sat down in the middle of the procession and refused to move in any direction except toward the doors. A shepherd mix named Frost began to make the same searching vocalization as Boreal, low and continuous, and somewhere on the far side of what dog trainers classify as distress. Dissolved. 14 handlers calling commands that their dogs were declining to hear. The audience began to murmur, as the fields. The commissioner leaned toward an aide and said something. Deputy Commissioner Whitford stopped mid-sentence at the podium and looked at the floor with an expression of professional alarm. Sandhu, the event coordinator, was moving toward the handlers before the last dog had broken formation. She was 44, precise, just his own alley, possessed of the particular competence of someone who had managed federal government events for 15 years and had developed a very low tolerance for the unplanned. Her eyes swept the room for a cause. Found the glass doors. Found the old man. Landed on him with the certainty of someone who has identified the source of a problem and is now resolving it. She pushed through the side door and was outside in 4 steps. "Sir, I need you to move to the public area immediately. Whatever you've done to agitate these animals, you need to remove yourself from the vicinity, as this is a federal event, and you are disrupting a memorial service." The old man looked at her, not with anger, not with the flustered embarrassment of someone caught doing something wrong. Looked at her with the specific patience of a man who has been spoken to this way many times and has long since stopped finding it remarkable. "I haven't done anything," he said. "Dogs. I know what the dogs are doing." That stopped her. The quiet authority of it, not defiant, just certain. Behind her, through the glass, she could hear the handlers working. Calm, trained voices repeating commands. Leashes held with controlled tension. The dogs were not aggressive. They were not frightened, oriented. Every single one of them, she realized as she turned to look, was facing this direction. Facing him. A hand came to rest on her shoulder. She turned. The man standing behind her was in his late 60s, gray at the temples, in the dress uniform of a chief superintendent. His name tag read Gilles Marchand, and he had the stillness of someone for whom stillness is not a default state but a decision. Marchand was not looking at Sandhu. He was looking at the old man. His expression was not the expression of a senior officer managing a disruption. It was something closer to the expression a person makes when they are trying to reconcile what they are currently seeing with what they believe to be true about the world. "Patricia," he said. RC, his voice very quiet. "Back, please." "Superintendent, this individual has caused." "Patricia." He said it again with the same quietness, and this time it wasn't a request. She stepped back. Anchen moved forward until he was standing 2 feet from the old man. He looked at him for a long moment. The old man returned the look with his pale November eyes, waiting. "Warren," Marchand said finally. His voice had dropped to almost nothing. "Warren Croft." The old man, Croft, gave the smallest possible nod. "I was told you were gone," Marchand said. "I was told specifically that you had." He stopped, reorganized. "You've been in Kenora." "Dryden," Croft said, "since 2009, 15 years. Marchand seemed to do a calculation of some private kind. 15 years, and you're here? I saw the date in the paper," Croft said simply. "Thought I'd come." Marchand turned and looked through the glass at the floor. The handlers were still working, still calling, still holding. Dogs were still oriented. 14 trained animals pointing like needles at a single man standing outside in a barn coat. "My God," Marchand said softly. He turned back to Croft, looked past him to Sandhu, who had not stepped back nearly as far as she had been asked to. "Patricia," he said, "go back inside and tell them to release the leashes." She stared at him. Intendant. The deputy commissioner is on stage. Assemblies are. I know where everyone is. There was no edge in his voice, no sharpness. It was simply a fact impervious to argument. Go tell them to release the leashes. She went. The instruction moved through the handlers like a current. Release the leashes. It was a moment of collective hesitation. These were people whose professional identity was precisely in the connection between themselves and their dogs, and severing it in the middle of a federal ceremony felt like being asked to set down a weapon in an uncertain situation. Sergeant Dolan looked at Boreal. Boreal was still pointing at the door, making that low searching sound. Dolan unclipped the leash. Boreal moved. Not a bolt, not a rush. Graceful, fluid trot, head high, tail carrying its focused movement. Through the side door that Sandhu had propped open, across the pavement outside, to the old man. And then, when Boreal reached him, when all of them reached him, Rito was second, and Clearwater third, and within 45 seconds all 14 of them had come through that door and crossed the pavement and arrived. They did not jump. They did not bark. Pressed against him, heads to his legs, bodies leaning into him with a collective weight that should have staggered a man his age. He didn't stagger. He absorbed them the way an old tree absorbs wind, by not fighting it. He lowered himself to the ground. Right there on the pavement outside Scotiabank Arena, with the cold November air coming off Lake Ontario, and the sound of traffic on Lakeshore Boulevard, and he put his scarred hands on the two nearest dogs and said nothing, for a long moment. The handlers stood in a loose ring around the outside of it, watching, exervised. Some of them had been partners for years with these dogs, had built the kind of trust that is indistinguishable from love, and they watched their dogs press against this stranger with a devotion that looked, somehow, like recognition. Not of a face or a smell exactly. Something beneath that. Something in the structure of who he was. Oakes stood with the others, had let go of Rito's leash, and Rito was now pressed against the old man's left side, with his eyes half closed, making a sound she had never heard him make in 11 years. A low, continuous, resonant sound that was not a whine and not a growl, and that had no entry in any training manual she had ever read. Marchand came to stand beside Oakes. "Who is he?" she asked, her voice low. Marchand was quiet for a moment. As he spoke, he chose his words like a man crossing a frozen lake, carefully testing the weight of each one. "Warren Croft. He retired before you joined the division, before most of you joined." He watched the old man murmur something to the yellow Labrador, who pushed his broad head up into Croft's hand. He was RCMP Canine Division from 1976 to 1991. Atchin, Special Operations Attachment after that. 20 years working in places and in capacities that aren't in the public record. And the dogs? Marchand paused again. "You know the bloodline profiles we use? The temperament assessments? The scent imprinting protocols? The bonding sequencing that we run every new team through for the first 6 months?" He looked at her. Croft wrote them. Not most of them. All of them. He wrote them in a series of classified field reports in the 80s, and they were formally adopted into the National K9 Training Standards in 1994. He paused. His name isn't on them. That was a condition of the adoption. He wouldn't let them use his name. Oakes looked at the old man, at the 14 dogs who had collectively abandoned a federal ceremony to press against his legs on a sidewalk. "They've never met him," she said. "Then no." "Then how?" "I don't know." Marchand's voice was honest. "Maybe they smell something from the old kennels in Innisfail. Something in his clothing after all these years. Maybe it's something about how he carries himself. A posture they've been responding to their whole lives through training, and they recognize it in the original." He stopped. "Or maybe it's something that we don't have a protocol for. Something we can't quite measure." Inside the arena, Commissioner Whitford had apparently decided that a memorial service for fallen K9 officers was perhaps not the worst context in which to let the living K9 officers do whatever this was. Vince had turned, pressing against the glass. Phones raised. The families of the fallen handlers stood in the front rows, watching through the transparent wall. None of them, a woman in her 60s with her husband's photograph pinned to her lapel, had both hands against the glass. After a time, it might have been 10 minutes, if been more, Croft began to speak quietly to each dog in turn. Not commands. Something else. He ran a hand down the back of Clearwater and paused with his thumb at the base of her skull, as he gently in a specific way. The dog made a sound and her eyes closed, leaned close to Boreal, and said something too low for anyone to hear. Boreal's ears went back and then forward, and he put his chin on the old man's knee. Cullen watched this and felt something shift behind his sternum that he did not have a name for. Oakes watched Croft with Rideau. The old man had both hands on the shepherd's face, his thumbs on the dog's cheekbones, looking at him with the directness of someone reading a text they have read before, in a different version. He murmured something. Rideau's tail moved once, a single deliberate sweep, and then stilled. Sandhu had come back outside and stood at the edge of the group. Her clipboard was at her side, not raised. Still at something. Her face had done something she probably would not have authorized had she been consulted. She had been managing federal events for 15 years. She had never seen anything that looked like this. Jason walked to Croft and crouched beside him. "Warren," he said, "come inside. Introduce you properly. To the families. To the deputy commissioner." Croft looked at him. "No, you deserve to be in there." "I'm not interested in deserving things," Croft said. It was said without bitterness, without self-pity. As if it were simply a preference, like being uninterested in a particular food. "Then come inside for the families," Marchand said quietly. "As some affair. Some of them are the sons and daughters of men you trained. They don't know your name. Let them know your name." Croft considered this differently than he had considered the first version. He looked through the glass at the families, at the woman with the photograph on her lapel. He was quiet for a moment. "I remember the dogs," he said finally. "Every one of them. I remember Sergeant Haskell's dog. Talon, they called him, from the 93 Innisfail cohort. Best nose I ever certified. I remember Corporal Beaumont's dog. Big black shepherd mix. Sergeant Deschamps named him Rideau after the canal because he was long and dark and wouldn't stop moving. A yellow Labrador. The one that bore the old name. Is that third generation of the same bloodline?" Oak said. "We kept the name." Something moved across Croft's face, his hand on the Labrador's head again. "Kept it there. I don't need to be introduced," he said. "I need another person telling them their fathers and mothers were brave. They know that already." He looked at the woman at the glass. "She knows it better than any of us." He looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Croft addressed the dogs then, one final time. He didn't use commands. He moved among them, a hand on each head, a brief touch. It looked like the closing of a conversation. Each dog, when he moved on, settled, stopped their leaning, up with a new stillness, a resolution. "Go on," he said, to all of them, and none of them specifically. "They're your partners. Go back." The dogs went back. One by one, returning to their handlers, leaning into familiar legs, accepting the clips of the leashes that their handlers fastened with hands that were not entirely steady, as had been Dutty Fields. Rideau walked back to Oakes and pressed his shoulder against her thigh and looked up at her, and she saw in his eyes something she recognized. A dog that has completed a task and is ready for the next one. Looked up. The old man was already moving away, not hurrying. The same unhurried, economical walk, weight balanced, shoulders easy. Moving back through the parking area toward Bremner Boulevard, she called after him without deciding to call after him. "Mr. Croft." He stopped, turned. "Working with Rideau for 6 years," she said. "The bonding protocol, the scent sequencing, the trust-building exercises. I did all of it by the book." She paused. "I didn't know whose book it was." He looked at her for a moment. At Rideau, who was sitting at her knee watching him with the same alert attention. "You've got good instincts," Croft said. "So does he. The rest is just patience." A brief pause. Imprinting work in the early months. Don't rush the passive contact phase. The manual says 5 days. Take 8. The research supports it. They just never updated the manual. And he turned and walked away. No goodbye. No backward glance. He moved between the parked cars and around the corner and was gone, stationing, leaving only the sound of traffic in the cold, off the lake, and a row of muddy boot prints on the November pavement. Arena, the deputy commissioner, had returned to the podium. The ceremony was being reconvened, gently, usher. The way you reconvene something that has been interrupted by something that matters more than it does. The families had returned to their seats. A woman with a photograph on her lapel sat with her hands folded in her lap. She was looking at the side door, not at the stage. The handlers led their dogs back into formation. The wreaths were laid in Chaussee fields. The silence held for 60 seconds, and then for a little longer, because no one gave the signal to end it and no one rushed to. Oakes stood at attention with Rideau, looking at the wall of photographs. The handlers who had not come home, and beside each of them, the dog who had not come home either, paired in the same frame as they had been paired in the field. She thought about a man with a barn coat and a 15-year silence, standing outside in the November cold because he didn't need a seat, because he hadn't come for a seat. Thought about 8 days instead of 5. She looked down at Rideau, who looked back up at her. The procession moved forward. The wreath at her hands was heavier than she expected, dusty fields. Or maybe she was just paying better attention to the weight of it. Back to the center of the stage and set it down, and stood for a moment in the silence, and felt the full meaning of the day settle over her like weather. Outside, somewhere on Bremner Boulevard, an old man in a barn coat walked back to wherever he had come from, carrying nothing and leaving behind, in the bones of 14 dogs and the hands of 14 handlers, something that would outlast every polished stone in the building.